Starfield was, to me, quite the disappointment. From lackluster gunplay to simplistic space combat and near non-existent melee combat feel, the game left a lot of the heavy lifting to its setting and its world and its stories. Yet they too, sadly, left much to be desired. Bland and uncreative are words both apt and yet decidedly insufficient for the task of describing the near-terminal lack of even the most basic creativity found in Starfield's plots. Pirates hunting for a legendary pirate captain's treasure, oh my, how original, which of course can only be found by piecing together his cryptic clues. Or mysterious square rocks floating in space that give visions to those who touch them. That's only been the core plot of about 7 games in the last decade or so, I think. Or maybe that's a bit too exciting for you. How about you just be a spaceborne bounty hunter? The most obvious and immediate advice I would proffer to Bethesda when it comes to Elder Scrolls 6 is then to hire a writer whose resume boasts a pinch more than a recent graduation from a mail-order correspondence course in creative literature. But that is more of a quality question, and Starfield's greatest shortcoming is not necessarily in quality. Well, quality alone, at least, but rather in its design. For, interestingly enough, Starfield is a very un-Bethesda-esque RPG in many ways, including the fact that it has very few bugs, really, and runs quite excellently. The issue is that it also seems to lack all of the soul that made us forgive the bugs in previous iterations of their games. My first Bethesda RPG was Morrowind, and it remains to this day my favourite for the sensation of immersion it was capable of creating. That subtle yet unbreakable and clearly definable feeling of being there, and in turn of being invested in the world to the point where you do not choose to roleplay, you simply do. Very few RPGs have ever reached that lofty goal of immersion, despite most aiming for it. And whilst immersion is granted a difficult term to really name down the precise meaning of, and even more so the precise causes of, it is absolutely something you know when you see it. But there are parts of it we can determine to have more or less impact upon it. Graphics, for example. Good graphics undoubtedly help, but it is not all. Nor is it even a deciding factor. Some of the most immersive games I know, Morrowind, Kenshi, Vampire the Masquerade, they all look awful by today's standard, and yet their magic remains. Music, of course, is also nice and can be quite decisive in creating the right atmosphere. Morrowind's music, of course, was absolutely brilliant, and bad music can pull you right out of an experience as well. And that is the key word, really. The experience. The experience of being in a world, of being on an adventure, of creeping through a cave or assaulting castle walls. Simply put, the experience of being there rather than sat in front of your computer screen. And nothing is more lethal to the experience than a loading screen. Now, naturally, sometimes you can't avoid one, at the start or the end of a dungeon, for example, or a city, but these disruptive experiences should be kept to a minimum, preferably, again, to the end or start of something to not distract over much from what's about to happen. And preferably, the loading screens should themselves be topical. Take Morrowind's loading screens, for example. They are informative and in keeping with the game's style, rather than, a black screen. With this in mind, then, it seems a particularly poor choice to build your entire play experience around fast travel, and in turn, repeated loading screens. This also causes a whole wealth of other problems as well, like how it makes the world feel tiny. In terms of sheer square mileage, Starfield is probably the largest Bethesda game ever, But whereas in any other Bethesda game you can spin on the spot and wander off in any direction, in Starfield, if you do that on the first planet, you will wander through an empty wasteland for a half an hour or so until you hit an invisible wall. And then you gotta turn your ass around and get onto the ship, so you can follow the plotline until eventually being given the option to wander across other empty-ass worlds till you hit the next invisible wall. This quickly hammers the point home into even the most reptilian of brains that walking anywhere is pointless, and you should simply fast travel all the time, and also of course you never actually do any traveling. You don't fly to a new system, you teleport there. You don't walk back to your spaceship, you teleport there, turning an adventure with unexpected discoveries on the path and sidetracks into a 5 seconds delay as the game loads the next zone. This, in essence, removes all of the adventuring from adventuring. You're not walking across unexplored territory, coming across strange markers on the map that might be caves, or NPCs, or villages, or entire cities, perhaps. You won't get waylaid by something intriguing that happened off in the middle distance. You won't have a wizard fall out of the sky and splat on the ground in front of you. You won't meet a raging orc, which, if you just calm him down, will unlock some interesting dialogue. No, you're just fast traveling. You are completing Objective A before proceeding to Objective B and thereafter to Objective C, whereupon you will be given a handful of credits, a pat on the back, and a lump of XP, and then shoot along to repeat it all somewhere else. For lack of better verbiage, it makes the video game feel like, well, just a video game. This and the constant need to open tabs as well and select quick travel points endlessly reminds the player that he is in fact not sitting in a spaceship, but rather on his fat ass watching a slowly filling loading bar. Fast travel absolutely has its uses to eliminate tedium, like walking all the way back to the beginning of an empty dungeon after clearing it, for example, or speeding between hubs and cities, but it should be used carefully and sparingly, and in my opinion, honestly, tied to things like the Silstriders in Morrowind. Make it an experience to fast travel. Make it so that you have to actually go to the bus stop and take the bus to get to where you want to be. Make the fast travel a part of the immersion rather than simply pressing M, selecting the system, and clicking the warp button. And this is far from the only cardinal error Starfield commits in terms of immersion. The fact that every space station, every ship and interior looks the same, and that they are all filled by the same 3 enemy types: animals, pirates, or robots, with the pirates making up 80% of those corridor fodders, yet further reinforces that this is a beep boop video game. It is a collection of pixels with a health bar above it, rather than a bloodthirsty spaceborne marauder. Stiff and poorly animated dialogue scenes, and a dreadful beige filter draped unceremoniously and unnecessarily over everything, plus the terrible gunplay, hammers the last few nails home into the coffin. Now, individually, a lot of these shortcomings can be made up for in other ways. Morrowind's combat system won't win any awards either, as anyone who has played the game with less than 100% stats in a weapon can testify to, and its characters are even stiffer than those in Starfield. Hell, most of them aren't even voiced. But the world, it was full of wonder and discoveries. Strange magical mushroom houses, villages made from the shells of enormous silt striders, caves and castles dotting the landscape as you encounter wizards and warriors and fight bandits and necromancers. If the game can truly excel in one aspect, then that can make up for a great deal of shortfalls in others. Well demonstrated by Bethesda Games' legendary bugginess. Oft mocked, but never ruinous to the experience. So what lessons precisely can be learned from Starfield, and what can it focus on? Well, the problem again is that Starfield excels in next to nothing. The combat in Bethesda games have always been somewhat rudimentary at best, and that is sadly unlikely to change, so whilst I am tempted to say make better combat, or maybe finally just copy Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, but this seems unlikely to happen, so let's sweep the combat thing from the table right away, shall we? A story then. A field in which Bethesda really should excel, as their previous titles have had some real bangers. The entirety of the Dark Brotherhood quest from Oblivion, for example, culminating in the absolutely legendary Murder House quest, which everyone knows and everyone loves. Morrowind had tons of great quests. In fact, entire expansions were great. Blood Moon was fantastic in my opinion. And even Skyrim has a fair few standouts as well, like the Thalmor Embassy or Blood on the Ice in Windhelm. But Starfield has some of the most generic stories I've ever seen, from touching the mysterious artifact that shows you visions of the galaxy, or the pirate faction where a legendary pirate captain has left behind cryptic clues to his big treasure, etc. Sprinkle in the unavoidably stiff and awkward facial animations that Bethesda is so rightly known for, and it is a hell of a struggle to get invested into anything. Starfield seems stuck in this rut of non-originality, as if all of the soul of the universe has just been sucked out of it somehow. We'll return to this in a moment because it also is relevant to the one bright spot in Starfield's otherwise inadequate story: the companion characters, who are overblessed with dialogue and really does manage to inject a bit of life into things by always having something to say. And loads of conversations with other characters too. But their design, though, lets the game down mighty quick yet again, as they are just too generic. They look like no-name NPCs. A good companion should immediately be recognizable from the simple fact that they stand out from the crowd, because they, unlike the ocean of randomly generated chaff used to fill the cities, have been designed. Or at least they should be designed. They should be intriguing and attractive, appealing. They should make you want to bring them for their company, rather than just as another source of underwhelming DPS in a firefight. Bethesda did this alright in focusing more on companions, and they got halfway to the goalpost, but in their quest to create the deepest and most realistic character creator, forgot one simple fact: that people don't want to just be some normal dude surrounded by baseline humanity in their space epic. They don't want to be realistic normal people. They want to be the hero, the main character, with all his supporting cast in tow. And the Starfield companions just don't look the part. They look like randos. The most immediately unique of the bunch is Sam, and only because he's wearing a comically small cowboy hat. Compare them, for example, to Mass Effect's companions, the game Bethesda in many ways tried rather hard to copy with Starfield, but failed. Hell, even the main storyline is the same: touch magic, space rock, get visions. But Miranda, Jack, Garrus, Tali, they are all immediately visually identifiable as special in some way. Miranda's has copied her looks from an actress. Garrus, you've got his scar, Jack's tattoos, and Tali's spacesuit. Starfield has female NPC 1 and 2, plus tiny hat cowboy man and obligatory black dude. And the character design, sadly, is not the only case in which anti-inspiration looms so very large, because this is a reoccurring problem throughout the entirety of Starfield, and one that I do in fact hope that Elder Scrolls 6 will be to an extent immune to. Starfield is Bethesda's first new IP in, 25 years? And they have clearly forgotten the craft, because there is nothing in Starfield. the most unique aspect is the sort of NASA-esque style of everything, the more realistic look of the spaceship's interior and the colonies, etc. And that's nifty. I might even go so far as to say neat, because it is rather unique, but it also means that everything's the same. No matter how many colonies you visit, no matter how many spaceships you board, it's all going to be basically the same interiors. You're going to be wearing much the same style and appearance of armor, with some color differentials and mild shape examples here and there, and you're going to be wielding more or less the same types of guns as well. There is no experience of going from a simple set of armor into something legendary like Daedric here. Even the weaponry is rather boring in that they're mostly just guns, and occasionally you've got a low-tech laser rifle. That's about it. This also further extends to the environment as well. See, when you emerge out of the vault in Fallout, or get off the boat in Morrowind, or escape from the prison and the sewers in Oblivion, you are always presented with a world. Then given some minimal guidance like, hey, go over to that town over there, and then set free to wander wherever you want. And you want to wander because you look out and go, wow, there's ruins over there. What's that? Oh, there's a bombed out city over there. Oh, there's giant bloatflies in that direction. We seem to be level 15. Maybe not go that way. You are enticed to go somewhere because the environment is interesting. There's a hill up there, there's a forest over there, there's a blasted wasteland in that direction. Is that a city I see in the distance? I wonder if I can go there. In Starfield, when you emerge out of the mine, you enter into a dead, empty, desolate wasteland. A transitory hub where a random pirate crew lands, dispenses some NPCs so you can figure out how to press the right mouse button, and then takes off once you've killed all of the NPCs. In one of the most blatant combat tutorials I think I've ever seen. And you could wander off into the distance, but you can only go so far until the game is like, well, there isn't anything actually over there. This isn't the world. You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to get on the ship so you can start fast traveling. Blessedly, this is a problem that Elder Scrolls really shouldn't have. The lesson it should learn here is obviously keep the fantasy world fantastical, keep it magical, keep it interesting. Have the big beautiful cities, have the magical mushrooms, have the enormous fortresses and the ancient elven ruins. Give the player a reason to explore. Give him an intriguing world to get lost in, rather than another menu to open and click land on. This should also go double for the companion characters. Bethesda absolutely, again, made the right choice here, and honestly, the companion characters are, probably, in terms of dialogue richness, some of the best in gaming. I very rarely caught any of them repeating themselves. And they would have conversations with each other, touching upon their private histories with one another, their families, and they would even exposition on what a world was like, giving you information as to what had happened there, what might be happening there, and what you should keep an eye out on for. It was pretty damn good. If only the NPC looked like a companion as well, and behaved like one, that would be even better. Not going to go too much into details on this because frankly, well, I've made like 3 videos on what the future of companions in video gaming should look like. But Bethesda has taken a wise first step in the correct direction. They just now need to, well, complement the interesting dialogue with some actually interesting characters as well. And in an Elder Scrolls setting, I doubt that'll be all that difficult, really. You've got all kinds of interesting races and archetypes with which to play. You can have mages and wizards, alchemists and thieves and assassins and all manners of nonsense, rather than having them defined by the size of headwear they choose. And speaking of interesting things, Starfield is in many ways the culmination of bad Bethesda decisions that have been slowly piling up for years now. The beige filters, for example, or the filters in general that they like to put on things to make areas more thematic. Stop it. Just simply stop it. Brown exteriors and brown interiors have never been particularly popular. And if you're trying to represent a magical, enticing, futuristic landscape, you probably want, gleaming pure white metal skyscrapers, for example. You might want futuristic ponds filled with mysterious crystals mined from the bedrock of the planet. You might want outposts looking like cowboy cities on the edges of the system, with lots of dunes and dust and tumbleweeds blowing through. But you don't want everything to be the same shade of beige, to the point where even the trees become beige. Uniformity is not actually a very good thing when you're trying to create an interesting world, because when you've seen one off-brown place, you've probably seen all the off-brown places. The fast travel too is something that has slowly been sneaking its way into the franchise more and more. In Morrowind you could fast travel, but only by using the silt striders, buses de facto, in certain larger settlements, which you could then use to travel to those settlements. You could also use some limited teleportation magic as well, but fast travel was limited. This meant that if you were to go on a travel, it would actually be a travel, a journey, an expedition. And sure, that can be annoying in and of itself, and you should absolutely introduce things to get around it, like mounts, or you could go even crazier. Flying mounts, flying carpets. Maybe you can set up strange underground tunnels, or teleportation circles in magic towers. There are many ways to do this that actually have in-game effect, lore reasons. Maybe you could create the teleportation circle wherever you wanted, but it cost certain rare materials and you needed to spec into a certain school of magic to do so, for example. But if it has in-game effort, then it has in-game value. And whenever you get to the point where you can simply click on a point on the map to go there, you eliminate again the adventure, you eliminate the journey, you eliminate all of the interesting hijinks that can occur on the way, and you make the world feel smaller and less interesting. One of my most vivid memories of Morrowind remains when I was wandering out into the ash wastes for the first time, and an ash storm came over me. Now, the ash storm wasn't doing anything to me, but since I was so immersed in the world, I felt as if, well, I can't be outside in this, I've got to find some shelter. And so I found a crypt, a little hole down into the ground, and so I entered it. And scared shitless from the weird undead sounds in the basement down below, I simply sat there in the topmost entrance to this crypt, hunkering down, waiting for the dust storm to settle. That is what I mentioned earlier, where you roleplay without consciously doing so. And sure, you can add in various effects to cause this. In fact, I do kind of like this in Starfield. When you go to a cold planet, you should be wearing cold weather gear. Makes sense. In fact, survival elements is something that should be expanded upon. I always loved the optional survivor elements in New Vegas. Now, you should make them optional, because not everyone is going to want to do that, but there is a moment of clarity the first time you need to bend over in a toilet to lick up the last few drops of radioactive water from the bottom of it to keep yourself alive. Now that is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And being forced to seek shelter or build a little temporary tent or a heating arrangement whilst being caught out in a sudden blizzard, well, so long as you've managed to retain the magic of travelling, that will become an experience. But if you get it wrong, and there is a way to get it wrong, if you add in too much traversal for traversal's sake, then this will simply be seen as an annoying impediment, as an annoying way to slow you down and force you to stop. This is something else, by the way, that Starfield does with the weird exchange of the stamina bar for an oxygen bar, where even if you are in an environment filled with oxygen, if you are carrying too much and you move at all or run, your oxygen bar will deplete and your CO2 bar will increase, and if you keep moving, you'll start taking damage. Meaning that if you're carrying a teaspoon too much, you can actually kill yourself from walking. Now that is a negative impediment, and one that made me almost completely uninterested in looting anything thereafter, because, well, it's all the same gun, and it's a hassle to sell it anyway, as the prime selling kiosk on Planus only has 5,000 credits. Most of this garbage is simply weighing down my inventory, and is of no, if any, value to me whatsoever. That is another lesson that the Elder Scrolls should take. More Fallout 4, because Fallout 4's crafting system was quite cool. Even if something is absolute junk, well, at the very least you can break it down into craftable parts. Even if you never end up crafting anything from it, you now have a greater use for that typewriter. You have now imbued that typewriter with a sort of value. You've imbued a random bottle of glue with value. Whereas in Starfield, I was passing up laser rifles and phasers and automatic machine guns simply because they would weigh down my inventory and slow my travels even further. Oh, and as a side note on the topic of slowdowns and combat, whilst I think it is highly unlikely Bethesda is going to be doing much with their combat systems, and if they were, well, frankly, just download Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, navigate your way to the install folder, Control-C everything in there, and Control-V it directly into Elder Scrolls 6. That should take care of the melee combat, if nothing else, but for range combat, and Starfield in particular, in no way is a combat encounter improved by adding in enemies that have actually, literally, 4+ health bars. If I've got to reload half a dozen times to kill a single dude, I'm not using a gun. I am using a squirt pistol. And remember, Bethesda, combat in video games, often, revolving around combat, is supposed to be fun, not a clicker chore. Which incidentally also might bring up the question of Fallout's combat system with the VATS system. Now, personally, I much preferred VATS to not having VATS, because the shooting combat in Fallout and in Starfield was hardly the best gunplay one has ever experienced. In fact, I would go so far as to say it was decidedly subpar in virtually every way. From the feel of the guns to the sound they produce, it's just not very good. And if your combat system, in terms of gunplay, actually already sucks, well, then adding in a pseudo sort of time slowy down mode, well, at least it allows you to do some cool shits. Like whip out your guns and headshot 5 ghouls in one go. Though, mind you, you should make it so that it doesn't need to be used. Shooting the enemy by simply aiming at them should in essence have the exact same effect as using VATS, except in the case of you shooting them, you of course aim personally, and in the case of VATS, it relies upon your skill with the weapon to make the shots count. It is an optional feature, and one that I would like to see added in, again, as an option plus dismemberment. Now, is it realistic to blast somebody's head off with a .22 caliber pistol? No. But is it fun? Yes. Yes, it is, and it gives you the impression that your weapons are actually powerful, dangerous, lethal, and capable of inflicting harm upon the enemy, rather than merely tickling their health bars until, for unknown reasons, they choose to lie down and rub raspberry cream all over themselves and play dead for a while, at least until you've finished looting them. Or not, if the loot is more bother than it's worth. And in the case of Elder Scrolls, again, what lessons it can learn, in melee combat it is doubly important. When you're wielding a two-handed claymore, you want to be able to lop off limbs. You want to be able to knock people's heads off with an enormous warhammer. And, preferably, the damage you do should be reflected on the character itself. We've got several games now where you can actually see exactly where you hit someone. This too isn't exactly new technology either. The first time I remember seeing this was back in Jedi Academy, where if you dragged your lightsaber across a wall, for example, you would see the pattern it made. If you slashed a stormtrooper in a certain location, you would see the trace of your glowing blade crossing his body. It again gives you the ability to impact the world and see the immediate impact of it, yet further increasing immersion and, well, just good old-fashioned fun, frankly. Something, once more, Starfield was in somewhat short supply of. Lots of tasks, lots of tedium, but precious little fun. I do have still quite a lot of naive faith, however, in Elder Scrolls 6. Despite not having anything to back up that faith, mind you. No gameplay, no screenshots, no news, and even if we had news, why on God's good earth would you trust Bethesda any further than you can toss the building in which the company resides? Yet still, I think a lot of the problems with Starfield as I see them has more to do with the lack of the world, and the fact that Bethesda just simply doesn't appear to have the creative chops required to create a new world anymore. Whereas the Elder Scrolls, well, it's already a world. It already exists. You already have the references and the locations. You already know the magic that exists in it. You don't need to come up with anything else, and that might be for the better. Anyways, do let me know down in the comment section below what you thought of Starfield. What you thought could be improved, what you think Starfield did well, and what you might like to see either done better, returned, or wholly discarded for Elder Scrolls 6. And perhaps even whether or not you have any hope for that game. Till next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.